It's definitely not a good thing to be lonely, and it is bad for your physical, neurological, psychological health. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how loneliness itself is instantiated in the human brain. By the way, I'm Andrew, and this is Sense of Mind. This channel is all about helping you to upgrade your brain so you can improve your life. My goal is to give you the facts and information so that you can make informed decisions about how to improve your life and better it as much as possible. So if that sounds interesting to you at all, please subscribe to this channel. Okay, so back to loneliness. This is something that I kind of meant to mention in the last video, but you may be wondering, how do psychologists and neuroscientists assess how lonely people are? Well, the most commonly used assessment is called the UCLA loneliness scale. So it's basically a 20-item survey, 20 questions. How often do you feel that your interests and ideas are not shared by those around you? And how often do you feel that you lack companionship? There are, 18 other questions on there. So then researchers are able to take someone's overall score, and the higher you score on that, the more lonelier you are believed to be. So we all know that loneliness is an undesirable state. But more than that, it is associated with negative health outcomes throughout life, like an increased risk of mortality, which can even be higher than that of obesity and air pollution in some cases. It's also associated with increased cognitive decline, and one interesting finding with that is that people who score higher on the loneliness scale tend to, or are more likely to have higher amounts of proteins that are associated with Alzheimer's, so tau proteins and others, amyloid plaques. So it's definitely not a good thing to be lonely, and it is bad for your physical, neurological, psychological health. In the last video, I talked about how social media use, depending on how you use it, can make you lonelier or less lonely. So definitely check that video out if you're interested. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how loneliness itself is instantiated in the human brain. All right, what's up, everybody? This is Andrew. Before we get into this episode, I just wanted to say that these associations that I'm talking about here with the brain are mostly when the subject is at rest. So that's just something to keep in mind. I did that because I didn't want to complicate things with thinking about different psychological tasks that are involved in these other studies, and just wanted to have a baseline view of what the lonely brain, the socially isolated brain, is like just in general, without thinking about various tasks. Although in that article that I mentioned, they do include more of those kinds of task-oriented experimental procedures. So definitely check that out if you want to go deeper into this. But yeah, I just thought I'd issue that caveat before beginning, because I don't think I mentioned it sufficiently. So anyway, I hope you enjoy. I'll look forward to seeing what you think. I will be relying really heavily on a review paper that was published just recently in 2021 by Niccolò Zovetti and colleagues in the journal Epidemiology and Psychiatric Sciences. I will be listing out brain regions that have been found to have altered activity in people that score high on that loneliness scale, focusing on those regions that are obviously involved in social cognition. So let's begin. First, decreased activity in the temporal parietal junction. So this is an area, as it sounds like it might be, a junction between the temporal and the parietal lobes of the cortex specifically. This area has been associated in a lot of studies with understanding what other people are thinking, or understanding the intentions behind actions, has some relation to empathy. Decreased activity in that region, in the temporal parietal junction, for lonely people makes a lot of sense, because they're not going to be doing a lot of perspective taking if they're not engaging with other people socially. If you're not around other people, you have little use for a brain region that is involved in thinking about what other people are thinking. Okay, so next, one study has seen decreased blood flow between the ventral and the dorsal attention networks. So it's not super important to know which brain regions are a part of each of those, and they are really important in any task that requires your full attention. So one is involved in certain aspects of attention, the other is involved in other aspects of attention. And I know that's really broad, but the main point is just that they're really important for getting your full attention, for focusing on something. That might mean that people are having a harder time concentrating. I mean, that's a bit of a speculation with people who are lonely, but there are alterations to these networks and decreases in their interactivity in people that have ADHD. So it's not crazy to think that someone who is experiencing that, who's having lower functional connectivity between those two networks, is going to have difficulty with focusing attention. So maybe that's a question for you. When you're lonely, do you think it's harder to concentrate, to use your attention? I know that if I'm working by myself all day, it can be harder to focus on things than when I get kind of a boost of social life, of being around other people. I think that really helps me to refocus on things, and I'm not necessarily sure why. I don't know if it even has anything to do with this specific finding, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Okay, so the next finding is that during prolonged isolation, so like forced social isolation in an experimental setting, researchers have found that there is decreased overall activity in the cerebral cortex. Now that's really interesting. The cerebral cortex is that folded, kind of sort of twisted looking, gyrated structure on the outside of the brain. It's that thing you think of when you see a human brain. It's that folded, convoluted structure. And it is really responsible for a ton of different things. I mean, it's really hard to even summarize what the function of the cerebral cortex is, because there's so many functions associated with it, and it is connected to and intimately functionally connected with the rest of the brain. But in general, it does sort of higher processing. So it provides kind of most of the, you could say, processing power for the brain, because it does a lot of things like complex perception of all different senses. It is involved heavily in thinking, and consciousness is dependent on the cerebral cortex. And it's what allows for intelligence. And very interestingly, high levels of loneliness have been associated with a lower IQ. So kind of lower general intelligence, and that could have to do with a less functional cerebral cortex. But again, just keep in mind that we are just looking at correlations. We don't know which way the causal arrow goes, but those two could have something to do with each other. Lower general intelligence and loneliness through this connection of lower activity in the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the next one, in the prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex. So these are areas right at the front of the brain and right behind the eyes. And these are both involved in a lot of different functions, but especially behavioral, emotional regulation in the prefrontal cortex, and the experience of pleasure and the reward system generally as far as the orbital frontal cortex goes. So again, these are really general functions, but they're both absolutely involved in social cognition and especially both of them, damage in either the prefrontal cortex or the orbital frontal cortex tends to have an effect of disinhibiting people, so making them more likely to act out and not act according to kind of cultural rules. So it does make sense that there would be altered activity in these regions in people with high levels of loneliness. All right, so next, I think this is actually probably the most interesting finding of all. There's been a consistent finding in people with moderate and high levels of loneliness that they have lower activity and sometimes even lower volume in the hippocampus, so a smaller hippocampus. And so this may have to do with the fact that the hippocampus is what allows you to remember explicit memories, so memories of people, places, events, experiences that you had. These are all going through the hippocampus, and it is like forming that memory. One of those categories I just mentioned is people, right? So the hippocampus allows you to remember things about people and to form models about them, like so to understand kind of who they are and like form a mental model of them. And so if you have a damaged hippocampus, you're obviously going to have huge troubles with social cognition. You're not going to be able to remember who someone is, and even if you do, you won't be able to build on that knowledge of that person and kind of like increase your relationship with them. There's actually a super interesting study that was done. It was over a period of 14 months where these 8 or 9, I think it was 8 researchers went into Antarctica. These other neuroscientists wanted to do a study on them and look at their hippocampus as well as their levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, which is a protein that helps neurons to grow new synapses, new appendages, basically. They showed that on average, their hippocampus had shrunk by about 7%, but is actually confined to a region called the dentate gyrus. So that actually makes a lot of sense because the dentate gyrus is one of the few areas in the adult human brain that has been found to actually produce new neurons. So most brain regions don't make any new neurons throughout life except the dentate gyrus, and this is a part of the hippocampal complex. And so it could just be that people have less need for these new neurons when they are socially isolated, and therefore their hippocampus kind of shrinks over, or their dentate gyrus shrinks over time. But it is interesting that they were able to show a cause and effect, that it was in fact the social isolation that seemed to cause that reduction in size and in BDNF levels. They showed a reduced levels of BDNF. And they found that even a month and a half after coming back, that at least the BDNF levels had not regained their original levels. So there is a lasting effect of social isolation, and that just makes me never want to go to Antarctica on a research expedition, and luckily I will never be qualified to do that anyway. Okay, so those were the brain regions that seemed very related to social cognition and had consistent findings associated with them as far as loneliness goes. So again, we don't know the causal arrow with most of these things, but if that finding about the hippocampus is any indication, then we should be aware of this, because being socially isolated and staying lonely is going to have a negative effect on your brain. Each of us is different. Each of us is a different level of introversion and extroversion, and so we are not going to have the same need. You and I are not going to have the same need, level of need for social interaction. And if you have very few social connections, and this is just maybe not even possible to get out, well, as I mentioned in the last video, social media can be a way of helping you to actually be less lonely. The key is that you have to use it to actually strengthen existing relationships, or to, if you start new relationships, you have to make sure that you transition them into real life. All right, anyway, thanks so much for watching this video. Like I said, in the next video, we will be talking about the neuroscience of social media use and try to tie all these topics together. So definitely check that out. And if you don't want to miss it, subscribe to this channel by clicking that red subscribe button and hit the bell icon next to the subscribe button so you're notified and you never miss anything new from Sense of Mind. Also, please, if you got anything out of this video, just give it a like and let me know your thoughts below. All right, by the way, this video is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. It was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.